Hey everyone, welcome to the Wednesday lesson here at the Order of Eden. For the month of March, we're continuing through our series on church history, and today we're looking at the Desert Fathers. The name's a little deceiving because there were some women there too, but we'll get to that. So, who are the Desert Fathers? To answer that, we need to consider a little bit about the earliest times of the church. We need to think about the political climate during the start of Christianity. It would come in waves, but for the most part, the early church faced heavy persecution. They were persecuted by the Romans because Christians claimed that Jesus was the true king and they were allegiant only to him. The Roman emperors didn't like that much. And they were also persecuted by Jewish people because as a group splintering from Judaism, they weren't popular with them either. So of course at the time not all Christians were martyred, but if you watched any of my videos on the early church fathers, a lot of Christians were. Not all Christians were martyred, but many were also put in jail. Some would lose their jobs, others would be cut off from their families, a whole host of things. So in the early church, persecution went hand in hand with faithfulness. So suffering well was seen as taking up your cross. Around the year 270, a man named Anthony heard a sermon from Matthew 19, where Jesus says, "If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me." And this man, Anthony, took the advice to heart. He went out and sold everything that he had and gave it to the poor, and he ended up staying with a Christian hermit in the city, and he lived with him for about 15 years, but then eventually decided that he wanted greater solitude to give his life more fully to God. So he went out to the Egyptian desert. He stayed in the desert in near total solitude for 13 years. And by this time, Christianity had been made legal by the Roman Emperor Constantine. This was great, but this also posed some interesting problems that some early Christians didn't quite know how to deal with. Like I said before, suffering and persecution had become so closely linked with faithfulness that many Christians didn't really know what to do with their newfound freedom. Martyrdom was considered the highest virtue of faithfulness, but now they were safe. So some Christians, looking for ways to live a more rigorous and disciplined life for God, heard of a hermit out in the desert, and they decided to go find him. These men convinced Anthony to be their spiritual leader, and he spent years teaching people out in the desert. Anthony's biographer wrote that the desert had become like a city. People were flocking out to the desert to live these ascetic lives of prayer and fasting. And it quickly became obvious that more formal communities needed to be created just to keep order out there. These are the forerunners to Christian monasteries. Both men and women went out into the desert to withdraw themselves from normal lives and devote themselves completely to these communities. They would read and sing scripture together, they spent tons of time in prayer and fasting, and considered caring and loving for the people in their communities to be the highest virtue. No matter what you think of withdrawing from society, some people think it's an unbiblical concept, other people see it as a zealous way to give your life to God. These people who withdrew out to the desert had a major impact on early Christianity. Christian pilgrims would frequently trek out to the desert to learn from these desert fathers and to hear their sage wisdom. Many groups were still trying to work in the cities and would frequently go back to the cities to feed the poor and give alms. Anthony, who later became known as Anthony the Great, even went back to Alexandria with his disciple Athanasius to combat the Arian heresy. We'll talk about that next week. So while these people lived in relative seclusion, they were still a blessing to each other and really to the greater Christian world that was able to learn from their wisdom and teachings. Though they weren't monks like we think of them today, they were very influential on that movement that would come a couple hundred years later. There are a couple of other people worth mentioning besides Anthony the Great. A man who actually went out into the desert before Anthony was someone named Paul of Thebes. When he was 16 years old, someone was trying to put him in prison for his faith, so he fled out into the Egyptian desert and devoted his life to prayer and contemplation. Supposedly, no one knows if this is true, supposedly he lived out there in the desert until he was the age of 113. I have no idea if he really lived that long, but it was recorded that Anthony the Great, hearing of Paul, went out in search of him. Anthony the Great found Paul of Thebes towards the end of his life, and they got along incredibly. Unfortunately, the next time Anthony went to visit him, Paul had passed, and a disciple of Anthony the Great made a robe for Paul to be buried in. Another man of note is named Moses the Black. He was very tall and imposing and led a group of bandits along the Nile Valley. His group went around spreading terror and violence until one day he was trying to hide from the authorities and went to hide with a group of these desert fathers. He was so moved by the group's sense of peace and contentment that he immediately renounced his life of crime. He became a Christian and joined this colony of ascetics. So why are we talking about these people? Well, if you've been following my videos on church history, you may realize that I have to leave out a ton of stuff. These videos average about 5 minutes, so things get trimmed down a bit. But I do want to attempt to at least give you a wide view of things, even if it's just an overview. Next week we'll get into a big theological debate that took place among the more established church, but I wanted to make a pit stop to talk about this peaceful group of people out in the desert. They went out there to find solitude, but instead they found a community. We may not agree with everything they said or did, but they were sincere. And they lived lives of prayerful dedication to Christ and gave up everything in an attempt to be more like him. In a shifting time for the early church, they took up their cross in the best way they knew how. They weren't perfect, but they were as faithful as they knew how to be. And we can still learn a lot about resisting sin and temptation from them. But that's it for today. Next week on the Wednesday lesson, we'll be looking at the Council of Nicaea. If you don't follow me on social media, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. So, from everyone involved with the Order of Eden, thanks for watching. I hope it was a blessing, and I'll see you in the next one.